We're going to be in Romans 1. We're going to finish off the chapter today. That's verses 18 through 32. And at this point, Paul switches gears. Remember last week we talked, it was an awful lot about introduction, how Paul wanted to get there, and he was kind of laying out his credentials and things like that. Well, today, in this verse, it takes a dramatic turn. It switches from, I can't wait to get there, to, well, I guess you'd say, y'all are a bunch of sinners. Now, there are 24 different sins listed in this passage. There's one sin that is repeated, but there are 24 total. And I want to be clear right up front that when I read this, that even though you're going to hear me read the same sin repeated over and over again, sin is sin. There's no graduation or levels or degrees of sin. In our human minds, we like to say, well, I'm not a thief, so I'm not a sinner. But yet, I lie through my teeth all the time. And it's okay to lie, but it's not okay to be a thief. It's not like that. Sin is sin. And that's just the bottom line of it. So when we read through this passage today, and I'm going to read out of the New King James with a little bit of my own translation in it, just because, well, my history suggests that I can't read well. Or at least read out loud well. I want us to keep in mind that it's all the same to God. It's all failure. So let's read this passage. And it's a long one, but it's well worth the read. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and the unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Okay, now when you read that, you're going to think automatically that the righteous wrath of God is revealed from heaven, and you're going to think, as I normally do, that lightning bolt is hitting sinners. That there's a great flood coming. That crops are going to fail. Men and women are going to die of disease and pestilence. That terrible things are about to happen as we get into this passage. But we're going to find out that God does something a little bit different this time. And it's called letting sin have its due course. Because what may be known of God is manifested in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are seen, and being understood by these things that are, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. We are without excuse. God is clearly visible through creation. You're all without excuse. Because though they knew God, they did not glorify him as God. Or thanking, but became futile in their thoughts. And their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into the image made of corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things. Therefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness in their lusts of their heart, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, who exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to vile passions, for even their women exchanged the natural use of what was against nature. Likewise also men, leaving the natural use of woman, burned in lust for one another, men with men, committing what is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their effort which is due them. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind, to do those things which are not fitting, being filled with all unrighteousness, sexual immorality, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, evil-mindedness. They are whisperers, backbiters, haters of God, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, discerning or undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who, knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. I often wonder in that last verse, when it talks about those who approve and practice those, yeah, we understand that sin, like misery, loves company. But I often wonder if every time a Christian accepts and practices sinful behavior, if that verse wasn't just written right to us. Before we can understand the righteousness of God, Paul in this letter had to explain to us the unrighteousness of man. You see, before someone will come to God for salvation, they first need to understand that they're a sinner, that there is a reason for it. And Paul follows the same biblical pattern. First law and condemnation, then grace and salvation. And we're going to read about law and condemnation all the way through chapter 3, verse 20, before it changes. Paul paints kind of an ugly picture for us here. And I'm sure like you guys, there are neighborhoods that I just don't like to drive through. Places I don't like to go. But you know, I can avoid those bad neighborhoods, and I can turn a blind eye to it. But does that change the situation? Does my willful ignorance and willful blindness change the way it is? No, it doesn't. You see, a lot of times we learn in science classes and such like that today that man evolved. That at one point in time of however many trillions of years ago or whatever it is today, that we started out as just some single cell nothing and became smarter and evolved and got more complex and became better and better as time went on. But that's not what the Bible tells us now, is it? The Bible tells us that at the very beginning, man was perfected in the Garden of Eden. That he was the highest of God's creation. And because of sin, we have sank lower than the beasts of the earth and the insects. And you think, how in the world can we be lower than the lowest? But when we get through this, you'll see how man has de-evolved, how he has risen or has descended from the highest of God's creation to its lowest form. And the first thing we find is in our intelligence. Human history, we all began, as you guys know through the Bible story, that we began knowing God. God walked with me. God was here with me. And then Adam and Eve sinned. And the story started to change a little bit. As sin became more and more prevalent in the world and in mankind, they turned from the truth. You read the story of Cain and Abel, and you find out that after Cain killed Abel, Cain was pretty mad at God because God pronounced judgment. It made him mad. And he goes off on his own. And he just doesn't retain God. He just doesn't want any part of God in his life. As we read through this, you read that word to hold down the truth and suppress it here in this. And you're thinking, what does this mean? How do they hold it down? What they're doing, what mankind likes to do is we don't want to know God. Because if I understand that there's a God in heaven, that means my actions are accountable to someone. You see, we don't like that accountability. We would rather just go ahead and live as we want to live. We would rather just do what we want to do and not worry about consequences. But you see, that's a huge problem. There are always consequences. Whether those consequences are negative or positive, they're always there. There is no way to escape them. And then it leads into ignorance. Because as we read there, we keep reading that God gave them over. God gave them over. It leads into this ignorance. That man just, they didn't want to know God. They decided they're not going to honor him either. They're not going to be thankful to him. They're not going to give him his due. Of course, everybody wants the gifts of God. Everybody wants those blessings of God. But you just don't want to thank God for them. So man, the word worshiper becomes man the philosopher. Paul clearly tells us that the philosophy and intelligence of man is foolishness. And that it is. Having held down the truth of God and refusing to acknowledge God, man was left without a God. So what does he do? We are so created in such a way that we have to worship something or someone. So, mankind made up gods. Gods of all sorts of things. If you look out through human history or watch a History Channel or something like that, you'll see that every culture that's ever been discovered by the civilized world had some sort of form of worship. They had some sort of something that they worshiped or someone. Whether it was a bull or a beast or an oxen or a crocodile or something. Mankind must worship something. So he manufactured gods for himself. And from that substitution, if you will, of the incorruptible God to corruptible animals, mankind decided that, maybe I'm just a little bit better than this false God that I'm worshiping. Perhaps I should worship myself. You think, well, nobody really worships himself. Well, sure they do. We do it all the time. It's called self-centeredness, self-indulgence, self-satisfaction. And each time that happens, Satan gets to giggle a little bit. They think, well, how's that? You guys remember what I told Eve in the garden? If you eat this, you will be as gods. She ate, her eyes were open. And instead of glory to God in the highest, it became glory to man in the highest. And we see that so commonly today. It's everywhere where we turn. And I think Satan gets to giggle a little bit about it because what he said back in Genesis is being fulfilled and lived out in so many people today. And it's not just those that are outside of the church. It happens inside the church just as well and just as often. And if mankind is his own God, then it's just a little bitty short step into immorality. Because if I get to make my own rules, and I get to do whatever it is I want to do, then what is there else? I might as well just live for myself. Life's short. Eat, drink, be merry, and have all the fun I want to have. So then, mankind indulges itself. It lives a life that is completely self-serving. Lie of Satan, that we can be our own God, is swallowed hook, line, and sinker, and has lived out in the lives of so many people. As a result of this self-deification comes self-indulgence. And because of this sin, God gives up again. And it's not that God's, I'm done with humanity. Not that kind of give up. The give up that we read about is God, okay, you want to do this? Go ahead and do it. I guess if you would use it in terms that we would understand, it would be, God's given humanity enough rope to hang itself. That's how you want to look at it. But that's what this is. He's just, go ahead. And for this, as the Bible always says, you reap what you sow. These consequences that we see being made manifest throughout the world today are simply because God's letting us have our own way. And it's not that lightning's chasing sinners down and striking them. It's that God's letting sin have its due course, take its due nature. And lastly, consequences of sin. Because God has abandoned mankind to his own self-will and his own self-knowledge and his own philosophy, we find what is listed as a depraved mind in the text. And by this depraved mind, we find then that list of 24 sins. If you remember, I read that there are inventors of sin. inventors of evil intentions. Now you think, well, nobody's inventing sin. Watch the news. We find and create new ways to destroy each other almost daily. We find new ways to defile ourselves and those around us daily. And that leads into where we find that people aren't just inventing new ways of sin, they're encouraging and applauding people when they commit these sorts of sins that are reprehensible. Sins that we would normally not even consider to be acceptable. Now, I'm not an old guy by any stretch of the imagination. Unless you're about 15 or 20, then I'm like an ancient nerd. But I can remember a time when things that happen now, continually, every day, that are socially acceptable, weren't when I was a kid. If a man and woman lived together, it was shameful. Today, it's common practice. I remember a time when excessive alcohol was shameful. Drunkenness was frowned upon. Today, it's pretty common in the world. That if you got caught in a lie, it was a shame. Today, it's not like that now, is it? You're almost expected to lie at your job. You're almost expected. These things continue. And I know we've been over the progressive nature of sin before. Probably covered it many times directly and indirectly. But a sinful thought, once it's dwelt upon, becomes and progresses into an action. That action will progress into a habit if it's repeated. And if that habit's repeated, it becomes a lifestyle. And at each step, in each phase of this progression, we become more and more desensitized to the sin itself. So what do? We take more risks. We consume more. Because we can't get that same thrill that we had before. Those that have smoked or still smoke, I'll use that as an example just because it's a real easy one to use. If you remember the first cigarette you ever smoked, it liked to kill you, choke you out. The second one wasn't so bad. Third one's not so bad. By the time you threw your first pack, you're off buying more. Because the effect it has on you is numb. You become desensitized to it. You think, well, I don't smoke, so that's not a problem. Well, what about alcohol? Same sort of effect. What about drugs? Same sort of effect. Pornography, sexual promiscuity, lying, cheating, stealing, all of them come with a certain degree of thrill, a certain degree of pleasure because I got away with it, or I can do this and it won't have any consequences in my life. And it may not right away, but it will. And the opposite is also just as true. A godly thought to walk upon will progress into an act of kindness. An act of kindness will progress into a life of service to others. A life of service progresses into godly obedience and a life that honors God. This is why it's so important to us. It is paramount important to us that we must do like it says in 2 Corinthians 10. That is, take every thought captive and make it obedient to Christ. And that sounds tough, and it is tough to do. But in concept, it's real easy. When the first thought comes into your mind, the first thought, grab onto it. Call it what it is. Pray about it. Avoid it. Stay away from it. And you're going to have to do it over and over and over and over and over until that thought is captive. And it's not a problem anymore. Because it does take over and over and over to take these thoughts and keep them captive. Because if we don't take these thoughts captive, if we don't stop, we find ourselves a little further, a little further, a little further. You see, because that one cigarette didn't satisfy, that one beer didn't satisfy me. So now I need to have 2 and 3. Where if we would have captured that thought at the very beginning, we wouldn't have progressed to that point. So today, as Juan and Alan come and prepare for our last song, I want to ask you guys something. Simple little question. But it's a question that'll have lasting impact. Where are your thoughts taking you? Are they taking you to God or away from God? If your thought doesn't take you to God, there's only 2 choices, and you're going away from God. Whether that thought is one of alcohol, tobacco, lust, pornography, disobedience, lying, cheating, stealing, backbiting, hating God, proud, boaster, or are you inventing evil? Are you untrustworthy? Are you unforgiving? Are you unmerciful? 24 things. Where are you headed? I can't answer that for you. But what I can tell you is there's a whole book right here that God gave us on how to head in the right direction. There's one place for just a little bit. Everybody go ahead and stand up. We're going to take a few minutes to pray because this is a real good time to evaluate your thought life.